Hi everyone and welcome to this live sent broadcast from Beirut, Lebanon. We are here on OmVärlden and Al-Compass to report about one of the worst humanitarian crises so far. For the last 6 years, Lebanon has been in the forefront for the refugee crisis, and it's actually one of the countries that has taken in most refugees per capita in the region. And at the moment it's also facing its own internal turbulence with politics and a not functioning government, which might also affect the refugees even more. This week our reporters have gone around Lebanon to talk to the refugees, to hear about their lives and their situation. We have been to the north, we've talked to men working in building constructions, we've talked to poets and exiles, we've talked to young girls and single mothers trying to find hope in a refugee situation. And now we are here talking to some of the most important actors on how the world will solve this crisis actually. It's the EU, it's a UN agency, and it's an important Lebanese organization. I will introduce you first, Ryan Knox. Can you tell us what you're doing here and what the EU?
So I'm responsible for the EU Regional Trust Fund in response to the Syrian crisis, but with a focus on Lebanon. Mm-hmm. We call it otherwise MADAD Fund. It's a large vehicle through which the EU has chosen to respond to the crisis in the countries neighboring Syria. And
Karolina, what's your job here?
I work for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and our work in Lebanon is to support the Lebanese government and the authorities to respond to this refugee crisis that it's been faced with for the last 6+ years.
And Georg Ghali, what are you doing? What is your organization doing?
So our organization ALEF works on human rights documentation, and in the midst of the refugee crisis work on influencing protection policies at the local level, at the national level, and at the international level.
So you try to influence the outcomes of various strategies, one could say.
Exactly, to reform the protection space through policy change.
So let's start with you, Georg. And Karolina, what are the needs right now for the refugees? We talk about 1.5 million, even more refugees being here in Lebanon. What are the needs here for the refugees?
Well, on our side at least, there are large needs that are interacted with development gaps. What the refugees are facing from lack of access to certain rights, such as education, such as protection, such as health, are also due to lack of policies in Lebanon to really provide those services and those rights to even Lebanese citizens. So what refugees came and what the refugees are facing, it's something that is very constructively a problem in Lebanon since the end of the civil war in the 1990s.
Let's get back to that a little bit later. Karolina, from your point of view, what are the refugees lacking? And is there a shortage of funding?
I mean, the refugee, I think, just coming back to your question, what the needs are, I think given the size of this refugee population, that Lebanon is actually the country in the world that's hosting most refugees per capita, it goes without saying that the needs of the refugees as well as of the host community are huge. And these needs are not shrinking as the years go by. In some ways they actually increase because for every year that goes by, savings that the refugees had with them when they initially fled from Syria and arrived to Lebanon have been spent. They've been depleted, their debts are increasing because on average a family pays $183 US dollars in rent per month. And so you have those needs of the refugee population. We also see that their vulnerabilities are increasing. I mean, in a recent study that just came out, we see that 74% of the refugees live below the poverty line and 58% below the extreme poverty line. So their needs continue to be big, but at the same time, like Georg was saying, the impact on the Lebanese host community is also rising as the years go by. So you have needs on both ends, and if these are not met, and through sustained funding from the international community, we see a risk that tensions can rise between the communities, which would be very concerning.
Would you like to comment that, Ryan? The needs, have the international community done enough to provide the sources to
I
meet
think
these needs?
we're doing what we can. I'm speaking on behalf of the EU, of course, not the whole international community, but from the EU side, since the crisis began in Lebanon in 2012, we've increased our support by 6 times what we were doing beforehand. And that's now at the level of about €1 billion just for Lebanon. And that covers everything from humanitarian needs across to the needs, as my colleagues here were saying, of the host communities. And as the crisis has gone on, we think it's a protracted crisis. We need to think about system strengthening in the country so that we leave a sustainable result for what we've invested in.
So it's a huge demand. It's a lot of things that needs to be done here.
A lot of things, and it's not just for Lebanon. We always face the challenge every time we try and mobilize new money under the MADAD Trust Fund to see which country, neighboring country, needs the funds most, which communities need it most. So it's a real difficult challenge.
But you're dealing with the EU, and the EU is changing. You know, the governments are changing. The EU does not want maybe the refugees to come here. They're quite happy not to see them, maybe. Do you find it difficult to get the money, to get the will to fund these projects?
Well, I think the Trust Fund is an indication of the European interest to support the refugees in the neighbouring countries. We have now a Trust Fund with €1.3 billion for the neighbouring countries of Syria to support the refugees and the host communities. In addition, there's the Turkey Refugee Facility, which is €3 billion. So there is a sort of political will to provide the support.
So you think they're doing
and
enough?
It's not just short. It's not. I think we're trying what we can from the resources that we can make available. Of course, what you want to do is make those resources well used, so you have the impact that stays. And this is what we grapple with every day in our work on the MADAD Fund and with our partners in the UN and with our NGO partners, to try and make sure that we design programs that can have this thought about system strengthening. And I can give some examples of that across different sectors.
Let's get back to those examples. George, would you like to comment that? Do you think that the international community is doing enough to strengthen Lebanon? As you said, also Karolina mentioned, could be internal conflicts here. What do you think, from your point of view?
It's good, first of all, to mention that Ryan doesn't represent the whole international community.
I know that, he represents the EU.
But in general, we have a problem with how the international community is looking at the crisis, because we see that a lot of the efforts on burden sharing are not really always taken into consideration. Like
what do you mean? What do you mean?
Well, the space for resettlement options are shrinking year after year, and what's happening in Europe, in the US and elsewhere are not good indicators of how much the international community is still committed for resettlement space and other forms of burden sharing. What we have also as a problem is that the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan and other forms of financial support to Lebanon is also underfunded, and like year after year there's also donor fatigue, and there's not enough other forms of burden sharing, and usually conferences happening at the level of Brussels or at the level of London in providing commitments, even in Kuwait, in providing commitments are usually mostly financial commitments, and we don't see much growing on other forms of burden sharing.
You mean they don't walk the talk?
No, I just think that it's not enough. That Lebanon and the crisis requires not just financial support, which is underfunded, but it also requires other forms of durable solutions, such as resettlement.
Let's talk about the resettlements a little bit, Karolina. There has been some talk about where should the refugees go. What's the situation like for the Syrian refugees?
I mean, the government has a very clear policy that the long-term solutions, the durable solutions for the refugees are not in Lebanon. They are preferably in their home country, following repatriation in safety and dignity, or like George was mentioning, resettlement, which means that they are transferred from here to a third country, like Sweden, where they can then start their life.
But the EU don't want them.
And well, I think last year they were. It was a record year for resettlement. Actually, almost 24,000 refugees in Lebanon were submitted for resettlement to 20 different countries.
But isn't that an appalling figure, considering the huge amount of refugees that are here?
I mean, the need,
is that not a failure for the EU? Or?
It doesn't meet the need, but the previous year, in 2015, the number was 9,000.
So it's better anyway, it's
it was
getting
an
better.
increase, though this year, unfortunately, in 2017, the number will be around 13,000 who will have the opportunity to be resettled to a third country. So this remains a need to increase resettlement places. and especially pending refugees' ability to return in safety.
So we're talking about the resettlement of Syrian refugees, that it has increased and the EU has taken in more than the previous year, yet the figures are very, very small. George, there's now also been talk from the Lebanese government that the Syrians must go back to Syria. What do you think about this?
Well, despite that being like really up on the agenda in Lebanon, however, us as a human rights organization, we think this is not really the centrality of the debate. If the Lebanese government wants to see refugees returning, there needs to be more efforts on really ensuring safety back in Syria and working on a system where refugees could be informed and could go back voluntarily. Like,
what do you mean by that, voluntary?
We cannot be pushing refugees back to Syria, especially with the current situation in Syria where there's still a lot of instability. The conflict has not ended.
Is that what's happening? Are refugees being pushed back?
Well, in general, when we see policies on protection that are preventing refugees from access to certain legal documentation, which is progressive, but like in general, with all the statements that are taking place, the evictions that are happening at the municipalities, at the municipality level, we need to make sure that refugees are not pushed to go back to where it is still unsafe and where they have found refuge here in Lebanon, fearing that.
But I also imagine that some of the refugees do not want to go back. We met refugees that we talked to that said they do not want to go back. They cannot go back out of fear and they have nothing left. What will happen to these refugees?
I mean, some will. We've done surveys this year, intention surveys, to hear directly from refugees what their thoughts are about the future. And almost 90% say that they dream of going back to Syria.
But those that don't, what's going to happen
well,
to
for them, that's where the resettlement will be critical, that there remains in the coming years states that provide what we call resettlement quotas for the refugees who will not be able to return to Syria, even when the peace and the stability is sustainable. Some may have experienced trauma that prevent them from going back. Some may have specific needs, and then there are refugees of other profiles.
Anyone who would like to comment on this, or you want to comment, Ryan? No.
Just quickly, that we think that the current debate in Lebanon about only addressing return as one of the solutions it's not very productive. Like we want the Lebanese government, if they are producing a comprehensive policy, to really be engaging on resettlement, to really be engaging on the protection space that needs to be available here in Lebanon, and not just focus on the issue of return. The exercise needs to really work on other forms of durable solutions as well.
But the whole agenda is now to keep the refugees in the neighboring countries, not to take them into the EU. I mean, the EU is like not very open to taking in a lot of refugees these days.
But this is certainly pushing the Lebanese government to address this issue within that rhetoric, and this is really concerning for us.
Are you afraid of that?
Yeah, and this is where, I mean, resettlement both, of course, serves as a solution for the individual family who really needs it, who can start a new future in Sweden or in another resettlement country. But it's also an expression of, I mean, a political solidarity with a country like Lebanon, that other countries show that, look, we're willing to help you take some of the refugees on your territory and integrate them in our countries to alleviate.
You don't think there is a risk that they will end up like the Palestinian refugees, like generation after generation in permanent refugeehood here? Because they will not be let into Australia or EU or the US or...
We certainly hope that, again, the refugees dream of going back, and they are watching the situation in Syria develop very closely, and the international community, I mean, we're working on preparing for their ability to return. So, and there are different causes of the Palestinian and the conflict and the Syria conflict. So we certainly hope that will not be as protracted.
And refugees we meet, they all wish they want to return. So we cannot really feed the current debate with rhetoric that are not available. Like the refugees have expressed that whenever the situation is safe, they want to go back to their home
I think we have to
country.
dispel some myths a little that are happening even in European politics around, you know, what the refugees really want. I mean, I've lived in Syria 10 years ago now, and I know many Syrians who have been in exile for years, and they all tell you they want to go back to their own country. There are some which have significant and legitimate fears, reasons not to go back, and there we have to find a solution that's better. And I mean, I can't give you an institutional answer on the willingness of the EU to take refugees through resettlement, but you know, because that's beyond my pay grade. But I would say that I think, you know, on a personal level, we who sit here and work here can understand that Lebanon as a country in its current stage of development probably is not able to cope with having these people for such a prolonged period of time. And
Let's talk a little bit about that. What is the MADAD doing to make Lebanon cope then? Could you give us some specific examples?
yeah, so MADAD, I mean, we try and address the needs, we try and sort of address the needs of the refugees in the first hand, in their displacement, trying to find solutions and working with partners to help them in protection, child protection, women's protection. We try and support them in access to schooling, vocational training. We have scholarships for Syrians to go to universities in the neighboring countries so that we don't lose a generation.
Tell me about that. What does that mean?
So we provide scholarships for Syrians who are displaced in Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, to go to universities in these countries in order to ensure that those people who can be maybe behind the rebuilding of their country.
And that's a little bit of a new approach, isn't it, when it comes to development aid? Before it was like humanitarian blankets and food to exaggerate, and maybe then development.
I mean, I think someone who I know who was behind the MADAD Fund, they had a very good idea, and it was before anyone else was really thinking this way. It took us a while to get going, but it's basically how do we bridge humanitarian aid into long-term development aid, and that is this word resilience we all talk about. And resilience can be interpreted in different ways, but in a protracted crisis, we need to be able to support the people who need their support most, but build the institutions in the hosting countries so that they can also help their own vulnerable populations who are impacted by the presence of these refugees. And in Lebanon, we know that the most vulnerable Lebanese are where most of the Syrians have ended up living.
So this means that the development aid, if we call it that, will also go to the Lebanese poor?
Absolutely, and across the board. I can give you some examples, but we're working with education and protection, we're working with health services, we're working with water and sanitation, and we're expanding the scope a little bit more now as we go into this 6th, 7th year of the protracted
crisis. Is this
crisis.
a paradigm shift when it comes to development aid, would you say?
I think it's something that's happening across the board. We all ask the question. I know Karolina and I were at a conference on social protection in the context of forced displacement, that social protection systems need to think at the outset when they're in these hosting countries how they can be adjusted in the longer term, not just to deal with the issue in the short term with cash assistance to refugees.
It is a very interesting approach. But George, what does it do to a country like Lebanon if suddenly, let's say, foreign donors come in and build up the infrastructure in the country? What does it do to the eternal discussion or political situation?
Well, we should not forget that since the crisis has started, we as ALEF have always expressed to really work on this nexus that is now like the nexus core since the beginning of the crisis. And like what will happen, I don't think the impact would be that big. Like in the case of Lebanon, development funding has always been coming. Like there are World Bank funding and like other forms of support.
But also for the Lebanese poor at those times?
Well, since the 90s, and like if I'm not mistaken, in 2010 there was an assessment on livelihood in Lebanon before even the crisis was even happening. The problem, I think, what we think the problem is at least, is that how much are these development strategies from donors actually acquainted or working also on policy reform in Lebanon in order to create this long-term sustainability.
So you mean it could be gaps for the refugees sort of get a better way forward, and the Lebanese are left out, or?
No, but on the discussion on health, for example, like all development actors are working on enhancing the health structure in Lebanon, but it requires also hands-on strategic planning and policy making from the Ministry of Health in Lebanon in order to make sure that there's proper investment into the health sector, and there's actually a system that is being built where Lebanon can stop relying on development financing on the long term.
Yeah,
Would you
I
like to
think
comment
we
on that?
really emphasize this in all our conversations with the ministries we work with now, because you know, I mean, at the outset of the crisis, it's clear the government was not probably so willing to engage with the funding that was coming in for the refugees, and maybe eventually realized that it was something that they could use for the benefit of Lebanon as a whole, and support the people that they were hosting as well as their vulnerable poor. So we've had these conversations across the board. Only today I was talking about work in the health sector, where we're piloting a new costing model for primary health services, which we hope the Lebanese government will take in the future, because we think it's something sustainable. We think it's something that they can pay for from the public purse in the future. We have major challenges in the system in Lebanon in every sector. Lebanon is a very, let's say, private sector dominated health sector. Lebanon has a proliferation of different actors working in protection issues as well. So it's not as straightforward as, say, going to Sweden, where you have a very clear definition of responsibility and you know where the public sector is working and other actors come in.
Could it be seen, talking about Sweden, could it be seen like in Sweden we have this kind of money that goes with a student, let's say, or the person, that you can choose your healthcare, your schools and so on? Could it be seen this way, like the refugee would have a pot of money, or the poor Lebanese, and then they just choose the institution they need?
This has been the conversation on the humanitarian cash side, and it's an evolution. I think Karolina has more experience than me on this, but to think of a system where you have universal cash rather than conditional cash for vulnerable poor people. We're having a conversation also in Lebanon with the Ministry of Social Affairs about how their poverty targeting program for the poorest Lebanese can be reformed, can be improved, and can consider the possibility of a cash benefit for the poorest families.
What do you think about this cash benefit? Is it a good idea, or is it too
That
early?
has, when I joined UNHCR back in 1999, so a long time ago, I mean, then you had in refugee situations, you were giving in kind every month. The refugees
but that was
came
always like a
queued
small
up, and
amount for food.
I mean, you gave the food packages with the cooking oil and the wheat
but
flour
not like
and the
a
rice
coupon
and
to
so
go to
on.
university in London, if you like.
But today, I mean, what has changed is that now you instead give a cash transfer, and with that cash you can decide if you buy olive oil or canola oil, and if what kind of bread you bake or what kind of vegetables. So it gives you much more freedom and dignity, and that money you spend also goes in to the local market instead of importing products that are then handed out to refugees as gift. And I think there the big shift is that before, 20 years ago, you had in protracted situations like we have in Lebanon, where the refugee situation has gone on for more than 5 years. It was much like care and maintenance programs. Refugees were passive recipients of aid, receiving aid from the international community, and now
it's a big police
ride. And how can now, through the support we give, we, like Ryan was saying, we strengthen, we to the extent possible support the host country in responding to the needs by strengthening the capacity of their institutions, which also means you leave something behind, and at the same time you provide support in a way where the refugees themselves are empowered to, because then you develop the skills. I mean, the university, if you get if during your time here you manage to get an education, a university degree, that will hugely benefit
But how
your
common
ability
is that
to
really,
return.
George? How common is that the refugees get this kind of access to education as we're talking about here? I mean, there's also, they come from maybe another country, they have a different curriculum, how do they get into the Lebanese school system? Do you know,
the largest share of MADAD investment is by far and away education. I mean, we have over 35% for Lebanon of our contributions are on education, which means non-formal education for the kids who aren't in school, and this is fundamentally important that we address innovative ways to get kids to re-enter the education system, or if they don't enter the education system, but to go into vocational training, these kind of things.
A lot of kids don't go to school.
A lot. I mean, we don't have the accurate figures, unfortunately, because
I mean, but it's around. I mean, between children between 3 and 18 years old, around 49% is the figure, but then that don't go to the public schools that the ministry runs.
But what were you going to say about the education, that the kids are in the schools, or?
I mean, we are the international community, not just the European Union, but other countries are supporting Syrian kids to attend Lebanese public schools. We're also, on the back of that, trying to invest in a revitalization of the Lebanese public education system, because before the crisis, and even today, only 30% of Lebanese kids go to public schools. So
that is a challenge for you to get the Lebanese authorities on board and to support and strengthen.
This is one sector where the Lebanon has maybe gone a bit further with education, and the Ministry of Education and Higher Education. They've really bought into the support that's there, and to their credit, they've really tried to create space for the Syrians to come into the public schools, which are, really
well, compared to
lacking
the rest of the European countries, maybe they are pretty good at that.
Well, yeah, I mean, so you can say on the one side it's a success that there are kids in schools, but then you have to look at the issues that prevent kids from going to schools, and this is where we're really concerned.
What do you say is the biggest challenge there? Or kids not going to school, Ryan, and then coming?
Well, I mean, there's so many different issues, which are protection issues, essentially.
Poverty, I think, of the families. I mean, as I said, if more than 70% of the families live below the poverty line, 58% below the extreme poverty line, that means that many children are asked by their families to support the family going out
to go to work,
doing informal work instead of going to school.
This is what we saw also when we talked to the refugees we met. What do you want to say?
Well, as Ryan was saying, is that most of the Lebanese service sector is actually privately run in some way or another, and like he shared exactly the figure about how much Lebanese students always used to go to private schools rather than public schools. Well, since the beginning of the crisis, there have been the establishment of the RACE program, which is the Reaching All Children's Education, which is funded mostly by the international community, and it's one of the most successful cooperation between the international community and the Ministry of Education on building that. The program on paper is very good because it looks on several sectors that are in need of, in matter of proper development of education in Lebanon, from the access to schools, to innovating the system, to reforming it, to working on the quality of the education. However, for the last couple of years, I think most of the focus of the donors has been on bringing children to school and not necessarily looking at the quality of the education that has been done. A lot of the
What do you mean by that?
Meaning that numbers looks promising on September, in the beginning of the school year, but we don't know if these numbers continue throughout the academic year. Like we have a large number of dropouts. We've seen Syrian children like passing from one grade to another. However, with literacy problems, which is a sign for us that maybe the quality is not very good. I think what we are calling for as ALEF, and with a number of other Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian organizations in Lebanon, is that there is a need to diversify the RACE program and focus on the other pillars that are part of the strategy, mostly innovating the system and allowing civil society to have a better role in providing services and providing some form of added value to the children and helping them in the curriculum.
What could that be, added value?
Well, the curriculum is very different, and the language is very different. Like sciences are taught in English or French in Lebanon. So basically, parents are not usually able to do that, either for vulnerable Lebanese or for Syrians. So there is an importance actually to help them out, because if nobody can help an 80-year-old at home and like basically cannot receive proper certificates by the end of the school year or whatsoever, it's not going to help him stay in school. Like this is also another area. This is very important, but it goes back to how much also the government is interested to play its role as a duty bearer in a human rights framework, that education is a right and there is a need to provide it, rather than it is a program in which they are only working on satisfying indicators.
So George, you were talking about the international community focusing too much on enrollment for kids in school. I would like to ask you, Ryan, what does this mean? Has it been too much focus on indicators, ticking off the box sort of thing?
I think it's clear that the big investment has been on putting kids into school in whatever ways we can, either through direct enrollment in public schools or through non-formal education channels. But of course we have been working on the side to develop a strategy for the country, and that process has been a long process, and it's a work in progress, let's say. So we have the RACE framework, the pillars are there to address the long-term quality system strengthening stuff, We want to go in that direction. I think the international community is more and more keen to do that. Every year, though, we find ourselves with the school year a financial gap to cover the cost of enrollment.
So there is an enormous amount of money that needs to be pushed into
Yeah.
realizing all these strategies.
Yes, I mean, you can, of course, question the costing model that's come up with to see how much it costs to put a child into school. And I think we're also having conversations in the financial subcommittee for race about how that model can be revised so it's realistic. So, I mean, I think it is right now. Some of the experts, it's not my area, but some of the experts are saying it's almost costing too little, and others say it's too much. So we need to look at that.
But will international aid money help to solve this crisis? Is it going to be enough?
Lebanon needs to have political will. As the case of any good development worker, you know, if you're working with public sector service delivery improvements, you need political will from the hosting country. Without that, it's very difficult to make long-lasting impact.
George, to make long-lasting impact, and you also talked before that the Lebanese poor will need to be included in the system. One could think that the Lebanese government should also pay more themselves.
It's not just pay more, the strategies have to be properly consulted. Like since the 90s, Lebanon is facing underdevelopment. Has there been any strategy that is open and properly discussed, or there's a strategy in parliament to see really how that is going? This is really our problem as a Lebanese civil society. What you're noticing is that most of the discussions are not happening. Like donors are coming, World Bank is coming and working on these strategies, but is there a debate in Lebanon?
And
Like
also, is there enough taxation within Lebanon? I mean, they're very rich people here as well.
Taxation is also an issue of political will. I will not, I'm not an expert on taxation, I will not comment on that, but I will comment on development in Lebanon. It's not a new area. We had that since the end of the civil war. And unfortunately, a lot of debates are not part of the public discourse. Like when we speak about...
Why?
I think it's because it's a subject that doesn't want really to be, a lot of the evidence present doesn't want to be shared in some way or another, like how much unemployment there is, how much Lebanese there is. There haven't been a census since 1933.
But is there political will, do you say, in Lebanon, to make a real change here?
I wouldn't comment whether there is or not, but I think the discussion is not happening in a way to show that there is a political will.
Anything you would like to...
The parliament has never met on the Syrian crisis.
Really?
On refugee issues. Like there have been a couple of meetings on the side, but really a crisis that has been that important for the last 6 years, has there been a parliament discussing the impact of these policies or addressing new policy change that needs to be done or legal frameworks? It hasn't taken place.
And it could be more difficult now with a not functioning government.
It has always been modestly functioning.
What about the EU? Is it, how can you ensure, or not you, I mean the international community, you can also comment, Karolina, ownership over, how can you ensure that Lebanese also takes ownership of these programs?
We have a long-standing partnership with Lebanon. This crisis response money, it comes after years of support to bilateral long-term assistance to Lebanon. And there we've always had the perspective that Lebanon is a middle-income country, a country that should be able to build public service delivery systems in a way that we have in European countries. Across the board, there are examples that already exist in Lebanon. Maybe they're not always functioning perfectly. I think of social insurance systems that exist. People pay a share of their salary and as their employers contribute, so they have a social insurance benefit. And so these things exist. Maybe they need some work and some assistance from our side to try and bring them up to a level. But and I would add also that there is a huge advocacy drive for these kind of reforms from the very let's say the civil society in Lebanon. There's a huge human capital with great ideas. If I take another example of something that's being discussed in the parliament right now, it's the decentralization law. You know, this has been on the cards for a long time, but nothing really happens because of the confessional makeup of the country and the interests of different groups. But now I think, you know, that this is when the problems at the local level are so visible for Lebanese communities and for the refugees, and the problems sit around municipalities, water establishments, social development centers and primary health centers at the local level. Lebanon really needs to rethink about whether they have a centralized model or a decentralized model. And I think those conversations are something we can help on. But it takes a big long-term perspective.
Maybe I can just, I think now we're focusing a lot on what's not working, and there are always things that can be improved, but I think we should also remember that in many ways, it's a miracle that a relatively small country like Lebanon, that had just over 4 million inhabitants, has received more than 1 million, maybe 1.5 million, we don't know the exact number, of Syrian refugees, hosted them for 6 years or so, and then previously had hundreds of thousands of Palestine refugees, and that Lebanon has maintained its stability so far, its hospitality, its welcomeness. It's not, pushed people into the sea or pushed people back to Syria. So there are things that can be strengthened in the system and policies, but the human kindness and Lebanon has saved lives. Lebanon has saved millions of lives of people, and it's doing every day. And I think the international community, needs to remember this, that even if the Syria crisis in Lebanon does not make the headlines anymore, like it did back in 2013 when you had thousands of people flowing over the border every day, that the needs remain. They're actually greater than ever, that they often are in protracted emergencies. And you need to work on the development, but you also need to remember that the humanitarian needs, there are some things that the refugees will continue to need that will never be delivered through the public institutions. And if they are not delivered, refugees will be pushed deeper into poverty and will not develop that resilience we talked about that they need in order to be able to repatriate and rebuild their destroyed country.
Let me just stay a little bit on the Lebanese question, George. Is there a risk that there could be internal conflicts in the country when development aid are, building up structures, maybe strategies for the poor, and you don't really have these debates, as you said? Is there a political dilemma here?
No, I don't see the development aspect being a factor in escalating conflict. I think a lot of the funding has been done in order to create those coping mechanisms and those systems to prevent and to manage this kind of escalation. Like we need to give, we really need to see how much municipalities now play a larger role in identifying those gaps and responding to them at the local level. I think in general, humanitarian work and development work and the nexus that is happening is actually some way or another de-escalating that, or at least working on an infrastructure or an ecosystem that prevents violent escalation of conflict. I'm not saying that the risk is not present. Like, it's an unstable country. In your introduction, you spoke that we don't have a functioning cabinet, that the Prime Minister has resigned. I'm not saying that politically there is instability present, but I think what actors are doing, from donors to UN agencies to local NGOs to international NGOs, I think they're creating this ecosystem to prevent further escalation.
So you, Karolina and Ryan, you have also described that there's been a lot of hope, good new strategies, good thinking, good collaboration with the Lebanese government, and also a country that has taken in more refugees than many others, and considering the EU and all that's going on there, where we don't really see refugees anymore to the extent as before. One normally says that a generation is approximately 10 years, something like this. 10, 15 years. Now there's almost a generation who's been refugees here. What do you say, Ryan? Do you think it will be a lost generation?
We're trying our best to make sure it isn't. It's very challenging when you go out yourself and see people living in these informal tented settlements and see the conditions they're living in, and you just wonder how it can be this way, that people have to live in such difficult conditions. It's very hard to say what the resolution to this problem will be for anyone. We don't have a crystal ball. A lot depends on what happens in Syria in the end, how that crisis, that conflict resolves itself or not, and how long that takes. But for the time being, I think these refugees will remain in Lebanon in quite large numbers. And obviously we have to talk about our European domestic migration politics and figure out how we deal with that to help Lebanon. But I think, we anticipate that there will be, as Karolina is saying, more continuing needs to help those people in this country.
So we're finalizing here. What do you say, Karolina? Is there a lost generation or a more resilient generation? of refugees?
Yeah, I don't want to say a lost generation because I don't think so. But it will be it's certainly a generation that's deeply affected by the experiences they've gone through before leaving Syria and coming to Lebanon, and their experiences in Lebanon. And I mean, I often meet parents, and I think that's one of the most difficult to meet, parents who say, look, first when I came I thought maybe it would be a year or maybe 2 years, and that's okay if my child misses a year or two of school, but now 5, 6, maybe 7 years, who knows how long, then they see when they look at their child that this is going to have an impact on their possibly entire life or a big part of their life. And that's why it's so important that the international community continues to support Lebanon, to support the refugees and itself, so that they can use the time they spend in this temporary exile in a meaningful way and build their human capital, because they're going to need that to rebuild Syria.
And so, George, you get the final word. What do you think? Is it a lost generation or a more resilient generation?
Well, as a Lebanese citizen and as a Lebanese civil society organization, we have a responsibility to prevent that. Like, Syria is a neighboring country to us. It's very important that Syrian society, once Syria is peaceful and they go back to Syria, that there isn't a lost generation. And this is why we work on that. We want to give a positive example about democracy, about relationship with state institutions, about services, and about good quality of development, so that could be brought back to Syria. We have more responsibilities than donors and international NGOs. Syria is a neighboring country. We cannot have a lost generation like in a neighboring country next to us. Like, this is why we're engaged into these discussions as well.
Well, thank you so much for taking part in this discussion about what the international community is doing and how Lebanon is responding. And thanks for watching OmVärlden and Al's Compass time here in Lebanon, and that we've talked about the refugee situation and what the international community is doing and all the new strategies of trying to make the refugees not become a lost generation. And let's hope for the best for the future. Thanks for watching. Bye.